Hey everybody, here we're going to look at the ancient China, the Shang and Zhou, pronounced Zhou like the person's name, dynasties. Talk about technology and then also rivers. Like we've talked about rivers before, where rivers are very important in terms of the development of civilization and kind of how that leads to that. I mean, we hit that a little bit yesterday with that video on the Shia dynasty where that started with the control of rivers. So that's one thing that we'll kind of work on there. All right, I'm going to minimize myself here for a little bit so we can talk about the different rivers. You know, in terms of all of these major early civilizations, we've got Egypt and the Nile River. We've got the Tigris and the Euphrates in Mesopotamia, and we've got the Indus and Ganges River in India, in those kind of previous units we looked at. In China, you've got here the Yellow River, and you saw about how the Xia dynasty and Emperor Yu, possibly mythological, tamed the Yellow River, and that enabled them to have that civilization. So that's a pretty good graph there. With rivers comes a little bit more agriculture, and you get more populations, and you need those populations to start controlling the river in terms of having agriculture. And then when you get that agriculture, you get larger populations, and then that leads to cities. And then in cities, you're going to have people doing more and more different jobs because less people have to do, farming. And then you get a hierarchy where you have different people doing different jobs, and you have people that are richer than other people. That kind of all comes with civilization. That's kind of review on all the different things we've talked about so far. All right, restarting. We've got the Yellow and Yangtze River in China, which are places where civilization starts. A couple of things to kind of point out in terms of China and why maybe it's a little bit more, we think of isolated than other places. So this region here in China is all a big desert. And so there's not a lot of people that live there. And then here, where you've got the border of like Afghanistan and Vietnam and India, those are all big mountain ranges. And so when Chinese civilization starts, it's really kind of isolated, but it does start along these two major rivers that are going on, just like, you know, usually civilizations start along those rivers. Yep, I'm gonna go away. So you've got settlements that are on the Yellow and the Yangtze rivers. Obviously, that needs then civilization. So you need to start having like police and armies that are going to, enforce laws and make sure that people can build those public works projects. Think like the public works are kind of similar to what Emperor Yu did with the damming of the river and the turtle and the dragon that kind of helped him out, right? In order to have civilization, we need to be able to control the water because we have these bad flooding. And so you've got dynasties that then extend their control over larger and larger regions in China and eventually start to trade with other people. Like we know, once places start to trade, they really advance a little bit faster. So after the Shia dynasty, which again is mythological, we've got a whole bunch of different dynasties that are ruling China. You've got the Shang and the Zhou, which we're going to talk about today. The Shang dynasty kind of goes along the same place. Let me see if I can get a different color as the Shia dynasty up here on the Yellow River. And then you've also got Tang and Song dynasties that are going on a little bit later. We'll talk about that in a while. All right, what makes a civilization? Stuff that we've talked about. You can control agriculture. You've got specialization of labor where people are doing different jobs. So once we can grow enough food, and people can grow food to feed more than just themselves and their family, they can start doing different things like, being priests or being educators. or building dams or being blacksmiths, stuff like that. You wind up with cities, and then you've got that social hierarchy where you've got different people on different levels of civilization, where some people start to have more money than the others. Um, we start to have religion, education, just kind of like what we think of in terms of society and what society needs to work. And then we start having better forms of economic exchange where people start using money, instead of, maybe trading. People have different markets and things. And then because of that specialization of labor, you also get development of new technology and developments in the arts where people can start doing things that aren't just um, say for producing food, but then they can start doing things for entertainment. And so that's part of civilization as well, with getting more parts and stuff like that. Oh, let's bring my picture back up. So there you've got some agriculture in China. You've got agriculture starting, a lot of rice farming and things like that. And people are using things like cattle to help them farm. So that is something that is coming along as well. So the Yellow River, there you've got a big picture of it. Because of the kind of soil it kind of has this yellow tinge. And there you've got, it builds up on there and has silt, and it forces water and can then have those terrible floods. And that's really where we get if you remember back, the Shia legend of Emperor Yu, who controls the Yellow River. And so once the Chinese learn how to kind of dam and control the Yellow River, they're able to mitigate some of those floodings, even though you still do have a lot of floods going on in China. Um, Soil really easy to work, and so you can have a lot of large harvests, and it's a good place for agriculture because you've got the Yellow River. So first, the crop that is mostly grown is millet. Millet's kind of like wheat. It's kind of like corn. It's a grain crop, so you're eating the seeds of the plant. That's starting up in the north, but then also kind of moving to rice later on once you get that civilization system. So once you get people that can control the rivers and have the irrigation system, then you get the authority, and then you get those dynasties happening. Oops. And so you've got ruins of different villages that we see, kind of the stuff that we found in the Shia dynasty, that people started having these villages in China and started building them into kind of major cities early on. And so the cities that, Shang rulers kind of have and that other groups have, they've kind of been similar to Chinese cities all the time. They're kind of organized along this big grid structure. They start to have these walled towns, and they start recognizing people as kings that are ruling. And then you've got, different places that they are ruling there. We've got a royal tomb that shows kind of the Shang leaders. Remember, the Shang are those people with the oracle bones that are the first people to start with Chinese writing. Remarkably, with those oracle bones, again, they are, basically the same writing that we even have today in terms of Chinese. So, like, if you know Chinese today, you can read, the ancient Chinese letters from, 4 or 5 thousand years ago. And so that social hierarchy part, it happens in all civilizations. You've got a king, somebody's in charge because they're the ones that are organizing different things. And so King Wen was seen as kind of like this big member of the Zhou dynasty, is seen as like a really, really solid ruler overall. Okay, so the Chinese have a lot of technology going on. You've got agriculture surplus, so everybody doesn't have to farm. That means other people can kind of get rich. They have developed the casting of bronze, which is, using tin and copper to make bronze is a much more effective metal than copper or tin on their own. And so by using that, they can get more weapons and then they can, go and take over different places. You've got heredity in the Zhou dynasty is really important. So the people that are in charge are related to each other. And they get this big military tasks and they are able to do that irrigation stuff we talked about. And then some of those officials do have some education. We'll talk a lot more about Confucius next week when we look at different Chinese philosophies and stuff like that. You've got, very big rules of etiquette and how to, act during the Zhou dynasty. So the Zhou are the ones and the Shang are the ones we kind of know about going forward. So you've got still most people are farming. They haven't really gotten like farming technology where a lot of people are in the cities like we have today in the US where, 1 out of every 50 people is farming. But you do have these artisans and craftsmen that are able to, make their goods and sell their goods in cities that are then able to use their money to buy the crops that other people are creating. Most people that are working for those higher class people are living pretty well. But still, like the vast majority of people are peasants. They are living in the countryside, and they are not owning land, but they're actually paying a percentage of their crops to the leader. The leaders learned early on that asking for a percentage was better than, saying you have to produce this every single year because by asking for a percentage, it actually encouraged the people to grow more crops. And some people think that's why there's like that work ethic in China today, even with those types of things, because they had to work hard in order to get more food. And so they get agricultural, military, labor services. Once they start building the Great Wall, the peasants are ones that wind up building a lot of the labor services. Some of them are using that to pay off their debts, and they're going to get plots that they can then farm. And so the leaders would then protect them, and then they have to give a portion, remember, just a percentage of that harvest back to the leaders. There are slaves in China. You've got captured enemy warriors, you've got debtors, that people that owe money that then are forced to clear fields, build walls, um, build temples or palaces and things like that as well. Um, Again, you've got the Shang Dynasty where you've got some human sacrifice and other types of things going on during the Shang that we see in archaeological discoveries. There you've got some kind of aspects of specialization. So you've got the bronze storage jar. People are building things out of bronze, and people are also then making silk. And so that silk can be used to trade and go things like and then make money, and then they can buy the excess food with the money they get from that. Same kind of thing there with the bronze jar. You can kind of make that and decorate it, and then somebody's willing to pay for it. And then with that money, people can then go and um, buy other things. And so you've got all those different specialists there. Silk's kind of interesting. For a very long time, nobody knew how the Chinese made silk with silkworms because they kept that kind of a secret for themselves. Um, and so they were then able to trade and kind of when we talk later on about like the Silk Road and trade in China and how they get wealthy, that silk's there. Eventually, what happens is the cat gets out of the bag and people discover what's going on with silkworms, and China no longer has the monopoly on silk than they had before. As they talked, we've got people making bronze and things like that, as well as jewelry and jade. Two different types of jade. You've got kind of green jade and white jade that's used to make really kind of expensive jewelry and things like that. You've got people who are embroidering things in clothing in terms of silk and stuff like that. And then you've got the silkworms that we hit on a little bit earlier. And so you've got Chinese religion, and even today still really focuses on the ancestors. And so you've got like there a vessel where you're gonna have rituals to honor the ancestors, kind of like if you see Mulan, right, where she's got to go and honor the ancestors, and they're trying to protect you. And so that's a part of Chinese religion and even Japanese religion and Korean religion that goes back really, really far, is this idea that you are honoring your own ancestors. So it's not like there's a single God. It's not like, some of the religions that we might think about in terms of Christianity or Islam or Judaism. But really, the Chinese religion focuses a lot on ancestors and things like that. Um, they do have this kind of heavenly power or heaven. Remember, that is the mandate of heaven that we saw in that article we read earlier, where leaders are seen to have, given the power of heaven by, this force kind of that is able to give out those kinds of powers. And remember, the leaders can gain and lose the mandate of heaven by being good or bad rulers. But mainly what they're doing here is they are, worshiping ancestors, and that's the main part of the religion. And so something that winds up happening is that, you've got spirits of your ancestors that go to another realm. You're living with your ancestors all the time. So just like Mulan, you got the spirits of your ancestors are talking to you and protecting you as you go through. And then also, you also have this like idea of the family, right? The patriarchal, so the father leads the family, and based on your position in the family, you're supposed to do certain things. So, the oldest male child might have to be the one that goes off and fights for the king, that tries to protect those people from, invaders or things like that. So one form of money is you've got shells that are used where people can trade shells. Again, a lot easier to use shells to trade as money than to take all your goods and services and just go and trade them. So it's easier to use those smaller things. Eventually, during the Qin dynasty, which we'll talk about, I think next week, um, they'll actually start coining money and having, different types of money that are standardized instead of having, kind of everybody deciding what kinds of things they're going to use as money. And so initially, the early dynasties in China aren't trading as much as they will later on. There's the Himalayas and the Hindu Kush Mountains between China and India. And then in the north, there's these big deserts. So it's the Chinese civilization, as a lot of civilizations do, start off as pretty isolated, and then they really start to trade. And during the Zhou era, start building ships and start doing these other things that really kind of lead to more and more trade. You've got those shells from Southeast Asia. You've got starting to have military technology from Mesopotamia and trade there. And then you've got jade and tin from different places as well. So by the time of the Zhou dynasty, China's really a big part of the world. They are not nearly as isolated as they were earlier on. There you've got silk. They really advance in terms of making silk. We talked a little bit about how they have that as their main source of trade. And so by having silk, they can then trade with other groups and get the things that they want. Um, Again, there you've got the Silk Road kind of in that map and the trade that China is doing all around kind of the Middle East and even to Europe. By later on, the Qin dynasty is actually what gives China its name for the Europeans eventually, because the Qin are actually already in BC trading with like the Greeks and the Romans, and they know that those people are out there. What happens is that people want silk. Silk's really nice. It feels good. And so they're able to trade that because they really have a monopoly on it with everybody else. Similar to how like India for a while had a monopoly on pepper, where they said they didn't let anybody know where pepper came from. Silk's kind of the same thing. Eventually, though, people do discover that yes, silk is made from silkworms and things like that. Chinese are starting to make books, and they're starting with writing and having like technology in terms of putting these together, and that enables us to really see a lot of Chinese history that we don't know about in terms of other civilizations. So Chinese writing, Chinese bookmaking goes back a really long way, and because of that, we can kind of see what people were thinking even way, way back when. So the Shang are able to use bronze in terms of their military. They're able to have, um, uh, chariots and things like crossbows that are, better militarily than what they have. There's the Shia forces that maybe only have stone and wood weapons. And so that's kind of like that legendary thing with the Shang and the Zhou talking about how they defeated that mythical, possibly mythical, dynasty of the Shia. So even early on, you've got the Shang using like crossbows, which are really, really innovative weapons that enable their military to then take over the Shia, and then eventually the Zhou kind of develop that technology even more before that Zhou dynasty breaks up. Again, they're able to get the bronze and there, and so then as the Iron Age comes in, um, the Zhou are able to use that a little bit, even though it's a little bit more cheaper, easier to make once they figured out how to use iron. The Zhou aren't able to, control everything, and kind of leads to a bunch of different groups during the Warring States period, fighting with each other late in the Zhou era. You've got nomads that invade from the north, which necessitates the kind of building of the Great Wall initially. And you've got people that say we're not going to support the king because we don't think that we should have to fight in order to preserve, his wealth. So that's just what we were hitting at there. The Zhou start building the Great Wall, 700 BC, to keep out those invaders from the north. As most walls, it didn't work very well. China gets invaded over and over again by, from the Mongols to even the last Chinese dynasty is invaders from the north, the Qing. You know, over and over again, people are going around the wall, but the Zhou start building it, and then successive Chinese dynasties will build it over and over again. And so you've got there, in terms of art, you've got bronze and writing kind of advanced stuff going on with the Zhou. So Chinese writing and in Chinese writing today, each symbol stands for a word. They are still like pictographs, kind of like hieroglyphics in Egypt, if you're familiar with that, where you're trying to, write with pictures. They haven't changed a whole lot in the years since. Um, and then they kind of combine them to have different stuff going through there, so you can kind of develop what the language is. The Chinese writing as well as Japanese, well, Japanese writing does have kind of some phonetic elements, but it's not like you can read something in Chinese if you don't know Chinese. So like I can kind of read out Spanish or I can read out English even if I don't know the words because I can pronounce what the letters are. In Chinese, it's not like that. You basically have to know what the symbols mean, and each symbol stands for a word. So that's, part of Chinese writing and language. Maybe if you remember from human geography last year, that they have pictograms. Interestingly, and we'll hit on this later, the Korean emperor in like 1300 switched from having pictographs to having a phonetic alphabet where you can sound it out. And so now if you look at Korean, they don't use the same letters that we do. They don't use the Latin alphabet. But what they do is they do have, letters that create sounds that you can read out. So the Koreans changed from having a pictograph to a phonetic alphabet. And what the Japanese did was the Japanese kind of took Chinese writing and then they added phonetic elements to it. So way back when, people found these oracle bones from the Shang Dynasty, which showed that people were, divining, trying to see the future by writing on them. And that's one of the ways we know that people were writing way back during the Shang. And if you look at Shang writing, it's actually very similar to Chinese writing today. So, 4,000 years ago, all the way through today, you've got kind of this continuous Chinese culture and continuous Chinese writing stuff going on. So there you've got the Book of Songs, a bunch of poems from the Zhou era, talking about all kinds of different stuff in terms of politics, right? The mandate of heaven, rituals, like things you should do in terms of religion, how you should live your life, what's going on with love, how you can be a good friend, how you should function in your family, how you should go to work, and then how you should entertain yourselves. Because remember, with civilization, comes entertainment as well. Um, so late in the Zhou period, you get what's called the Warring States, where a lot of people or a lot of these different kinds of kings are fighting each other for control. That ends when the Qin emperor comes to power here in 221 BC, and basically he takes like this policy. He's a legalist, and we'll talk about that later or next week. But he orders all books to be basically burned, and the only thing he allows written down is the government laws that people have to follow because he doesn't want people to be independent. He doesn't want people to challenge his own empire. And the Qin emperor, like, kind of because he was so strict, like, after he dies, his empire basically falls apart. But he still has pretty big influence in terms of, this legalist doctrine where we're not allowing the common people to have independence of thought. Think about like Ai Weiwei today in China, where the communist government doesn't allow him to be independent, or how the Chinese government looks at, independent thought and freedoms as not necessarily a good thing. And so some of these ideas in terms of legalism can still be seen in how China functions today.